In the basement archives of the Appalachian Regional Medical Center, beneath layers of dust and bureaucratic neglect, lies a manila folder that should never have survived the purge of 1987. Inside, a single photograph paperclip to a coroner's report tells a story so disturbing that 3 separate attempts were made to destroy it. The image shows a newborn, if it can be called that, with features so grotesquely malformed that the attending physician's notes describe it only as an anatomical impossibility. But it was the mother's medical history that made seasoned investigators physically ill. According to the genetic testing performed in secret, her child's DNA contained markers suggesting the father, grandfather, and great-grandfather were all the same person. Before we continue into this forbidden chapter of American horror, subscribe and leave a comment telling us which dark corner of the country you're watching from. Your support helps us uncover these buried truths. The story begins in 1983 in the remote hollow of Birch Creek, West Virginia, where state social worker Margaret Thorne received a call that would haunt her for the rest of her career. A neighbor reported screaming from the Caldwell property, a ramshackle farmhouse that hadn't seen visitors in over 2 decades. When Thorne arrived with Sheriff's Deputy Roy Hendricks, they found 17-year-old Mercy Caldwell in active labor, alone and delirious with fever. The birth itself was traumatic enough. The child emerged severely deformed, with a cleft palate so severe it split the entire face, limbs twisted at impossible angles, and what the emergency room notes describe as cranial malformations consistent with severe hydrocephalus. But it was Mercy's own appearance that first raised questions. Despite being just 17, she bore the physical markers of someone much older: premature aging, bone, deformities, and what Dr. Sarah Kellum later documented as genetic degradation typically seen in populations with extremely limited gene pools. Mercy refused to identify the father. When pressed by authorities, she would only rock back and forth, whispering, "Papa says it's God's will. Papa says the bloodline must stay pure." It was then that investigators realized they might be dealing with something far more sinister than a teenage pregnancy. Deputy Hendricks began examining the Caldwell property more thoroughly. The house itself defied conventional architecture. Hallways that led nowhere, rooms accessible only through other bedrooms, and a basement with multiple hidden chambers. In the largest chamber, they discovered what appeared to be a makeshift medical facility: rusted surgical instruments, moldy medical textbooks from the 1940s, and most disturbing of all, a collection of glass jars containing what the coroner later identified as preserved fetal tissue spanning several decades. But the true horror was yet to be uncovered. Social worker Thorne's investigation into the Caldwell family history revealed a genealogical nightmare that challenged everything she thought she knew about human depravity. Church records from the Birch Creek Baptist Church dating back to 1921 showed a pattern of marriages that violated both law and nature. Josiah Caldwell, the family patriarch, had married his own daughter Sarah in 1923, listing her as his niece on the marriage certificate. Their children, Mercy's parents, had in turn married each other, creating a family tree that was less a tree than a twisted vine, circling back on itself again and again. County records showed that Josiah Caldwell had purchased the Birch Creek property in 1920 with the explicit intention of preserving the purity of his lineage. Local historians discovered that Caldwell was a disciple of the eugenics movement, obsessed with the idea that his family possessed superior genetic traits that must be preserved at all costs. His personal journals, discovered hidden behind a false wall, contain passages that read like the fevered dreams of a madman. The outside blood is poison. Only through the sacred union of like with like can we achieve perfection. The journals also revealed the systematic abuse that had defined 3 generations of Caldwell women. Each daughter was isolated from birth, educated only in basic literacy and domestic skills, and prepared for her eventual role as both daughter and wife. Mercy's mother, Ruth, had been wed to her brother Thomas at age 14, producing 4 children before her death during a botched home surgery performed by Josiah himself. Medical examiner Dr. Kellum's report painted an even more disturbing picture. Analysis of hair and tissue samples from the Caldwell home revealed genetic markers indicating that the family's inbreeding had been far more extensive than even the church records suggested. The DNA evidence suggests at least 5 consecutive generations of parent-child or sibling reproduction, Kellum wrote in her confidential report. The miracle is not that the children were deformed, but that any survived to reproductive age at all. Yet somehow Mercy had not only survived, but had become pregnant. The question remained, who was the father? The answer came from an unexpected source. While cleaning out the basement medical facility, Deputy Hendricks discovered a leather-bound ledger hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Written in Josiah Caldwell's meticulous handwriting, it documented what he called his breeding experiments with scientific precision. The entries, dating from 1920 to 1983, recorded the birth, development, and often death of dozens of children born from increasingly close genetic relationships. The final entry, dated just 3 months before Mercy's delivery, revealed the horrifying truth. Subject M, Mercy, successfully impregnated via artificial insemination using preserved genetic material. Father: myself. This represents the ultimate achievement. The creation of offspring from grandfather to granddaughter, ensuring absolute genetic purity. Josiah Caldwell had been collecting and preserving his own genetic material for over 60 years, stored in primitive freezing apparatus in the basement laboratory. When Mercy reached sexual maturity, he had artificially inseminated her with his own sperm, making himself simultaneously the child's father, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather. But Josiah's experiments had gone even further. Autopsy records from the county morgue revealed that he had been performing these procedures on Caldwell women for decades. Mercy's mother, Ruth, had been impregnated by her own father 4 times. Her aunt Sarah had delivered 6 children, all fathered by Josiah. The preserved fetal tissue found in the basement came from the dozens of pregnancies that had ended in miscarriage or death shortly after birth. The genetic damage had become so severe that most conceptions were no longer viable. Dr. Kellum's analysis of Mercy's child, who died 6 hours after birth, revealed chromosomal abnormalities so extensive that she initially suspected the samples had been contaminated. The genetic profile suggests an inbreeding coefficient approaching 0.5, she noted in her report, indicating that the parents shared approximately 50% of their genetic material. This level of inbreeding is typically fatal, yet somehow this child survived to full term. The investigation might have ended there, filed away as another tragic case of rural isolation and mental illness. But Dr. Kellum's report caught the attention of federal authorities, who realized they might be dealing with something unprecedented in American medical history. In November 1983, a team of FBI investigators and genetic specialists descended on Birch Creek under the guise of a routine child welfare investigation. What they discovered in the Caldwell compound would remain classified for the next 40 years, only recently released through a Freedom of Information Act request filed by medical researchers studying hereditary diseases. The federal team, led by Agent Patricia Moore, found evidence that Josiah Caldwell's experiments had been far more systematic than local authorities had realized. Hidden in the compound's root cellar, they discovered meticulously kept breeding records dating back to 1890, inherited from Josiah's own father. The Caldwell family had been practicing selective inbreeding for nearly a century, guided by a twisted interpretation of genetic theory that predated modern understanding of heredity. The record showed that the family had originally consisted of 12 siblings who had been systematically paired off by their father, a self-taught physician named Ezekiel Caldwell. Over the generations, the family had dwindled as genetic defects took their toll, leaving only Josiah and his descendants by the 1950s. Yet Josiah had continued the experiments, driven by an obsession with creating what he called the perfect child, a human being so genetically pure that it would possess superhuman abilities. Agent Moore's team also discovered that Josiah had been in correspondence with several fringe genetic researchers throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Letters found in his personal effects revealed that he had been providing tissue samples and genetic data to underground eugenics researchers, who were using the Caldwell family as a case study in extreme selective breeding. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of Josiah himself. The 83-year-old patriarch was found in the compound's master bedroom, dead for at least 2 weeks. His body showed signs of advanced genetic disorders, skeletal deformities, premature aging, and what forensic pathologists identified as multiple organ failures consistent with severe inbreeding depression. Yet even in death, Josiah had continued his experiments. Beside his bed lay a syringe and vials containing what genetic testing later confirmed to be his own sperm, preserved and prepared for one final insemination. The implications were staggering. Josiah Caldwell had planned to father children even after his death, ensuring that his twisted legacy would continue for generations to come. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the federal geneticist assigned to analyze the Caldwell case, would later describe it as the most extreme example of human inbreeding ever documented in medical literature. Her research, conducted in secret at the Centers for Disease Control, revealed genetic patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions about human reproduction and survival. The DNA analysis of Mercy Caldwell and her deceased child showed that they shared genetic markers with an inbreeding coefficient of 0.47, meaning that nearly half of their genetic material was identical. To put this in perspective, siblings typically share 25% of their genetic material, while parent and child share 50%. Mercy's child was essentially the genetic equivalent of being its own sibling, a biological impossibility that somehow had achieved life. Dr. Hartwell's team discovered that the Caldwell bloodline had developed what she termed genetic compensatory mechanisms, mutations that had evolved over generations to counteract the worst effects of inbreeding. It's as if the family's DNA had adapted to extreme consanguinity, she noted in her classified report. The usual lethal recessive traits were somehow being suppressed by unknown genetic factors. But these adaptations came at a horrific cost. Medical records from the compound revealed that while Caldwell children might survive birth, they suffered from a constellation of disorders that made normal life impossible. Severe intellectual disabilities, bone deformities, immune system deficiencies, and premature aging affected every member of the family. Most disturbing was what Dr. Hartwell called accelerated senescence. Caldwell children aged at roughly twice the normal rate, reaching physical maturity by age 10 and showing signs of old age by their 20s. Mercy herself was a walking medical miracle and horror. Despite being only 17, bone density tests showed she had the skeletal structure of a 40-year-old. Her reproductive system, while functional, showed signs of advanced deterioration that should have made pregnancy impossible. Yet somehow, she had not only conceived, but carried the child to term, defying every medical understanding of how severely inbred populations should function. The baby's autopsy revealed even more disturbing details. Despite the obvious deformities, the child's brain showed unusual development patterns. Certain regions were severely underdeveloped, while others showed growth far beyond normal parameters. Dr. Hartwell speculated that the extreme inbreeding might have triggered unknown genetic pathways, creating a form of human development never before documented. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. In early 1984, social workers conducting follow-up investigations in the Appalachian region began receiving reports of other Caldwell family members living in remote hollows throughout West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. What federal investigators had assumed was an isolated case of one deranged family turned out to be part of a much larger network of related bloodlines, all practicing varying degrees of consanguineous marriage. Agent Moore's expanded investigation revealed that Josiah Caldwell's father, Ezekiel, had dispersed his children throughout the region in the 1890s, establishing what amounted to breeding colonies in isolated mountain communities. Each group had been given specific instructions to maintain genetic purity, while occasionally exchanging genetic material with other Caldwell settlements to prevent complete genetic collapse. The discovery of these scattered communities sent shockwaves through federal law enforcement. In hollow after hollow, investigators found families that had been practicing systematic inbreeding for nearly a century, all guided by the same twisted genetic theories that had driven Josiah Caldwell. Some communities had died out completely, their bloodlines too damaged to sustain life. Others had adapted in ways that defied medical understanding. In a remote settlement called Crow's Nest, Kentucky, investigators found Sarah Caldwell Morrison, Josiah's great-niece, living with her husband-brother and their 7 surviving children. Medical examination revealed that Sarah, despite being only 28 years old, showed signs of advanced genetic disorders that should have been fatal. Her children, all products of brother-sister unions, displayed a range of deformities and developmental abnormalities that nonetheless allowed them to function at a basic level. Most disturbing was the discovery that Sarah was pregnant with her 8th child, conceived just months after giving birth to her 7th. When questioned about the rapid pregnancies, she explained that Papa Josiah's teachings required women to bear children as frequently as possible to strengthen the bloodline. Federal medical teams realized they were dealing with communities that had essentially turned human reproduction into a form of livestock breeding, with women treated as nothing more than vessels for continuing the genetic line. The investigation expanded to include Tennessee, where authorities discovered the largest surviving Caldwell settlement, a compound housing over 40 individuals, all descended from Ezekiel Caldwell's original 12 children. Led by a patriarch named Nehemiah Caldwell, this community had developed its own twisted interpretation of Christianity, believing that genetic purity was a form of divine worship and that mixing with outside blood was tantamount to blasphemy. FBI raids on the Tennessee compound in August 1984 uncovered what federal prosecutors would later describe as the most systematic case of incestuous abuse in American history. Unlike the isolated Birch Creek property, the Tennessee settlement functioned as a self-contained religious community, complete with its own chapel, school, and medical facility. Nehemiah Caldwell, a 70-year-old man who claimed to be both patriarch and prophet, had established a rigid breeding system that assigned each woman to specific male relatives based on what he called genetic compatibility charts. These charts, hung prominently in the community's meeting hall, tracked bloodlines with scientific precision while justifying incestuous unions through biblical interpretation. The compound's medical facility contained records of over 200 births spanning 4 decades, with mortality rates that shocked even experienced investigators. Nearly 70% of children born in the compound died before reaching age 5, victims of genetic disorders so severe that many could not survive outside the womb. Those who did survive showed the familiar patterns of premature aging, developmental disabilities, and progressive organ failure that characterized all Caldwell descendants. Yet the community had persisted, driven by Nehemiah's conviction that they were creating a chosen people, purified through selective breeding. His personal journals, written in a mixture of biblical quotations and pseudo-scientific genetic theory, revealed a man convinced that his family's isolation and inbreeding would eventually produce children with supernatural abilities. "The Lord has shown me visions of the perfect child," one entry read. "Born of the purest blood, untainted by the corruption of the outside world. This child will possess the wisdom of Solomon, the strength of Samson, and the longevity of Methuselah. Through our sacrifice, through our dedication to genetic purity, we shall bring forth the new Adam." The reality was far different. Medical examination of the compound's children revealed a population ravaged by genetic disease, sustained only through constant medical intervention and the sacrifice of dozens of pregnancies that ended in miscarriage or infant death. Dr. Hartwell's analysis of the Tennessee bloodline showed inbreeding coefficients even higher than those found in Birch Creek, with some individuals showing genetic profiles that suggested their parents were more closely related than typical siblings. Most disturbing was the discovery that the community had been actively recruiting new members, not through conversion, but through kidnapping and forced breeding with genetically suitable individuals from neighboring communities. Court documents from the federal prosecution of Nehemiah Caldwell and his followers revealed a systematic program of abduction and forced reproduction that had been operating in the Tennessee mountains for over 2 decades. Young women from isolated farming communities had been targeted, assessed for genetic compatibility, and then either lured or outright kidnapped to serve as breeding stock for the Caldwell bloodline. The program was overseen by Rebecca Caldwell Hayes, Nehemiah's daughter-wife and the compound's self-appointed genetic counselor. Rebecca had taught herself basic genetics from medical textbooks and had developed her own theories about which genetic combinations would produce the superior children her father prophesied. Her records, kept with the same meticulous precision that characterized all Caldwell documentation, tracked the reproductive history of over 30 kidnapped women. These women, ranging in age from 14 to 25 when abducted, were held in a section of the compound that investigators dubbed the breeding barracks, a series of modified cabins where they were kept under constant surveillance while being systematically impregnated by selected Caldwell men. Those who bore healthy children were allowed to remain with their offspring and eventually became integrated into the community. Those whose children died or were born with severe deformities were often killed to prevent them from revealing the compound's location. FBI agent Linda Kowalski, who led the rescue operation, described the breeding barracks as something out of a nightmare, human beings treated like livestock, their only value measured in their ability to bear children. The rescued women, many of whom had been held captive for years, showed signs of severe psychological trauma and malnutrition. Several had been subjected to crude medical procedures designed to increase their fertility, performed by Rebecca Caldwell Hayes with no medical training beyond her self-taught genetic theories. The children born from these forced unions represented a new horror in the Caldwell saga. Unlike the severely inbred offspring of traditional Caldwell marriages, these children showed a different pattern of genetic abnormalities, often possessing normal intelligence but exhibiting physical deformities. And behavioral abnormalities that suggested their mixed heritage had created unpredictable genetic combinations. Dr. Hartwell's analysis of these children revealed what she termed hybrid vigor in reverse. Instead of the improved health typically seen when previously isolated populations intermarry, the Caldwell genetic legacy had become so damaged that any new genetic material only created new forms of dysfunction. It's as if the family's DNA has become a genetic virus, she noted in her classified report, corrupting any healthy genetic material it encounters. By late 1984, federal authorities faced an unprecedented problem: how to handle the legal and medical implications of the Caldwell case without creating widespread panic about similar communities that might exist elsewhere in rural America. The decision was made at the highest levels of the Justice Department to classify most details of the investigation and to prosecute only the most egregious crimes while relocating survivors under new identities. Nehemiah Caldwell and 6 of his followers were eventually convicted on federal charges, including kidnapping, rape, and child abuse, receiving life sentences in federal prison. The breeding compound was burned to the ground, officially due to structural hazards, but actually to destroy evidence of the genetic experiments that had taken place there. The surviving women and children were placed in witness protection programs and dispersed throughout the country, their medical records sealed to prevent identification. But the cover-up went deeper than simple witness protection. Dr. Hartwell's research, which represented the most comprehensive study of extreme human inbreeding ever conducted, was classified and buried in federal archives. Her recommendations for screening other isolated communities for similar breeding programs were ignored, and she was reassigned to routine epidemiological work. When she attempted to publish her findings in medical journals, she was threatened with prosecution under national security laws. The official story, released to local media, described the Caldwell compounds as isolated cases of child abuse and religious extremism, with no mention of the genetic experiments or the systematic breeding programs. Mercy Caldwell, the teenage mother whose case had started the investigation, was quietly relocated to a psychiatric facility where she remained until her death in 1987 at the apparent age of 43, though she was only 21 years old. Agent Moore, who had led the federal investigation, later reported that she had been contacted by researchers from other government agencies who expressed interest in the Caldwell genetic data for national security purposes. When she refused to provide access to classified medical records, she found herself transferred to a desk job in rural Montana, effectively ending her career in federal law enforcement. The message was clear. The Caldwell case was to be forgotten, buried beneath layers of classification and bureaucratic denial. But some secrets refused to stay buried. In 2019, genealogist Amanda Richardson was researching family histories in Appalachian communities when she noticed unusual patterns in century-old census records from West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Families with the same surnames appearing in multiple generations of marriage records, birth certificates that listed suspiciously few different family names, and death certificates that showed infant mortality rates far above regional averages. Richardson's research, conducted through publicly available records and DNA testing services, began to map what she called genetic islands, isolated communities where limited gene pools had created distinctive DNA signatures. What she discovered was that the Caldwell bloodline had not ended with the federal raids of the 1980s, but had merely gone underground, dispersed among dozens of small communities throughout the rural South. Modern DNA testing revealed that descendants of the original Caldwell breeding programs could be found in every state from Virginia to Arkansas, often unaware of their genetic heritage, but carrying the distinctive markers that Dr. Hartwell had identified decades earlier. Many of these individuals suffered from unusual medical conditions, accelerated aging, rare genetic disorders, and developmental abnormalities that had puzzled doctors for generations. Most disturbing was Richardson's discovery that some Caldwell descendants had been actively seeking each other out through genealogy websites and DNA testing services. Private online forums, hidden behind password protection and encrypted communication, revealed communities of people who had embraced their genetic heritage and were attempting to continue the breeding experiments that had defined their ancestors. These modern Caldwell communities, scattered across multiple states and connected only through internet communication, represented a new form of the old horror. Without the geographical isolation that had characterized the original compounds, they had learned to operate within mainstream society while maintaining their commitment to genetic purity through carefully arranged marriages and reproductive planning. Richardson's attempts to publish her findings were met with legal challenges from unknown sources, and several of the genealogy websites she had used for research suddenly restricted access to Caldwell family records. When she persisted in her investigations, she began receiving threatening messages, warning her to abandon her research into family matters that don't concern outsiders. Dr. Michael Santos, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University who became aware of Richardson's research through academic networks, decided to conduct his own investigation into what he termed cryptic consanguineous popula, taions in rural America. Using advanced genetic analysis techniques unavailable to Dr. Hartwell in the 1980s, Santos began mapping the full extent of the Caldwell genetic legacy. What he discovered was even more disturbing than the original federal investigation had revealed. The Caldwell bloodline carried what Santos identified as genetic load, accumulated mutations that, while not immediately fatal, created a ticking time bomb of hereditary diseases that could manifest in future generations. Children who appeared healthy at birth might develop severe neurological disorders in adolescence or experience catastrophic organ failure in their 20s. Santos's research revealed that the genetic damage from extreme inbreeding could remain hidden for generations, only to emerge when triggered by environmental factors, stress, or the natural aging process. This meant that thousands of Caldwell descendants living normal lives in mainstream society were carrying genetic time bombs that could activate at any moment. Even more chilling was Santos's discovery that the Caldwell genetic legacy had developed what he called genetic hitchhiking, the tendency for damaged genes to spread through populations more rapidly than healthy ones. When Caldwell descendants married into normal populations, their children often inherited disproportionate amounts of the damaged genetic material, creating new forms of hereditary disease that had never been seen before. The implications were staggering. If Santos's calculations were correct, the Caldwell bloodline had essentially weaponized human genetics, creating a form of inherited disease that could spread through populations like a slow-acting plague. Children born to parents with even distant Caldwell ancestry might develop genetic disorders that would not manifest until they had already reproduced, passing the damaged genes to another generation. Santos attempted to alert federal health authorities to his findings, but found his research funding suddenly cut and his access to genetic databases restricted. When he tried to publish his results, he was informed that his work had been classified under national security provisions and that any attempt to disseminate his findings would result in federal prosecution. Like Dr. Hartwell before him, Santos found himself reassigned to routine research projects, his groundbreaking work on genetic load buried in classified files that might never see the light of day. In the basement archives where this story began, the manila folder containing Mercy Caldwell's photograph and medical records represents more than just a case study in human depravity. It is evidence of an experiment that was never completed, a genetic legacy that continues to unfold in ways that its creators never imagined. The child born to Mercy Caldwell, the product of generations of systematic inbreeding, lived for only 6 hours. But in those 6 hours, it represented the culmination of nearly a century of genetic manipulation, the closest that human beings had ever come to creating what Josiah Caldwell had called the perfect child. The fact that it survived to full term, despite carrying genetic markers that should have been lethal, suggests that the Caldwell bloodline had evolved beyond normal human parameters. Recent genetic research has revealed that extreme inbreeding can sometimes trigger evolutionary mechanisms that allow populations to survive conditions that would normally be fatal. The Caldwell family, through their systematic breeding experiments, may have inadvertently created a form of human adaptation that could have profound implications for understanding genetic disease and human evolution. But this knowledge comes at a terrible cost. The Caldwell descendants living today carry within their DNA the echoes of their ancestors' experiments, genetic markers that could manifest as disease, disability, or death at any moment. They are walking laboratories, living experiments in human genetics that continue to generate data long after the original researchers have died. The federal cover-up of the Caldwell case was motivated by more than simple embarrassment over law enforcement failures. Government scientists recognized that the genetic data collected from the Caldwell bloodline represented a unique resource for understanding human heredity, evolution, and adaptation. This information was too valuable to be shared with the public, too dangerous to be left uncontrolled. Today, somewhere in classified government facilities, researchers continue to study Caldwell genetic material, using it to advance scientific understanding, while the descendants of their test subjects live unknowing lives in communities across America. The experiment that began in the mountains of West Virginia continues in laboratories where the subjects will never know they are being studied. In the hollows and ridges of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to ancient mountains and secrets run deeper than coal veins, old-timers still speak in hushed tones about the Caldwell curse. They tell of bloodlines so twisted that the very earth rejects their dead, of children born so malformed that midwives cross themselves and refuse to speak their names. But these are just stories now, folklore passed down through generations who never knew the scientific horror that lay beneath the mountain myths. The truth is far more terrible than any ghost story. Somewhere in America tonight, a woman carries a child whose genetic code contains the echoes of Josiah Caldwell's experiments. In a small-town doctor's office, a physician puzzles over test results that show impossible genetic combinations. In a research laboratory, scientists study tissue samples that challenge everything they thought they knew about human heredity. The Caldwell legacy lives on, not in the isolated compounds that were burned to ash, but in the blood and bones of people who will never know the source of their suffering. The experiment continues, its subjects unknowing, its results carefully catalogued by researchers who understand the value of genetic data obtained through methods that could never be repeated legally. In the end, Josiah Caldwell achieved a form of immortality that he never could have imagined. His genetic material, preserved and studied for decades after his death, continues to generate scientific insights that advance human knowledge while destroying human lives. He created the perfect child after all, not a single being, but a bloodline that serves as humanity's darkest mirror, showing us what we become when we play God with the fundamental building blocks of life. The manila folder in the medical archive tells only part of the story. The rest is written in DNA, coded in the genetic legacy of families who bear invisible scars from experiments they never consented to join. And in the quiet laboratories where government scientists continue their classified research, the Caldwell name lives on, a whispered reminder that some knowledge comes at a price too terrible to calculate. The most inbred child ever born lived for only 6 hours, but its genetic legacy will endure for generations yet to come, a secret written in the very essence of what makes us human, and what happens when humanity loses its way in the pursuit of perfection.